Mentioned to you before, the church and pastor and his family were always so hospitable, which is one of the qualifications of a pastor, to have his home opened up and to be hospitable. And that's what he was to this preacher and his wife in evangelism. And the church supported us. And at one time in our ministry, actually increased our support. And that was certainly an encouragement, as well as a model to me when I became pastor. We appreciate your friendship. Saw the family yesterday at Mark and Emily Go-Away's wedding and asked him if he was going to be anywhere tonight, and he accepted to come and preach. And so, Pastor Steele, if you would you come and preach to us from that good book you hold in your hand?
Well, I do appreciate the privilege to be with you tonight, and I've had the privilege of being in this pulpit many times, but it's been some years ago. I had another pastor friend that was here for a while, and he was bivocational, so on Wednesday nights I got to preach for him quite a bit, and so I do appreciate the privilege to be with you tonight, and always enjoy being with Rachel, and especially now they got that little bundle of joy, Lydia Grace. I tell you, I saw that coming. We prayed with them about that and asked God to bless them, and He has certainly done that. We're excited about that. And so we're going to be in the book of Ezekiel tonight, Ezekiel chapter 22. And as I was thinking about the message for this evening, and I remember reading a story about a pastor in Hawaii. And this pastor he pastored near a military base, and so he had a lot of military recruits that would come every Sunday, and they just kind of stood around and waited for somebody to give them orders. And so one day he was having a meeting with his Sunday school leaders and teachers, and they were talking about different things, and one of them said, to the pastor, Pastor, we've got a class of boys, and they are just out of control. They are unruly. And I just want you to know, Pastor, we just can't get anything done in there because they're so rowdy, and they're talking and race, and the teachers were just, at their wits' end trying to figure out what to do. And so the pastor said, you know what? He said, I got just a solution. So he called in a couple of those army guys. And he said, look, I want you to go into this class every Sunday. I want you to be in that class. He said, I want you to take one kid under one arm, another kid under another arm, and sit on one and just, rough them up and just be there and make sure that they don't disrupt the class. And the teachers thought, man, this is going to be a disaster. But those kids loved it and never had another problem in the class because they had those army guys in there and they kept them in check. And they loved it because those kids were looking for somebody to look up to. They didn't have any role models at home, and they needed somebody to show them a little bit of love, but also somebody to respect. And in this world and time, it's hard to find people that you can respect. I was thinking our world is in such a mess, and young people today, young men especially, aren't quite sure what a man is. Greatly privileged to have a great dad. I know not everybody has that. And, I'm grateful that I was thinking the other day, I don't know how many times my dad, and he's a humble man, he'll be, won't even want me to share this, but I can think how many times he'd come into the house and he would have the tire iron in one hand and a lug nut in the other. He's changing the tire and just snapped the lug nuts right off of it. Just clunk. And got to get a change, and didn't think anything of it, And he was a weightlifter and just, I can remember as a kid thinking, wow, that's something, And I don't know how many of you, I think probably as a kid growing up, one of my heroes, I guess, in the movies was John Wayne, and I know he was far from perfect, but one of the things that I found out about John Wayne, I was reading a story not long ago that John Wayne, according to this story, near the end of his life, he did make a profession of faith. And I thought that was really exciting, and it was done through a young lady who was As I understand it, she was either dying with cancer or in very serious health conditions, and her doctor was a personal friend of John Wayne's. And she found out he was going to be in a meeting, some kind of a dinner or something with John Wayne, and wrote him a letter and shared the gospel with him and said, you know, I'd like to see you in heaven someday. And he sat there and read that letter with a table full of people. You know, John Wayne, he was not one to show emotion, at least not like that. But my understanding is that as he finished that letter, and she asked him, you know, please make sure that you know the Lord and that you're going to heaven. And he told that doctor, he said, you go back and tell that little girl I'm going to see her in heaven one day. So that was pretty exciting. You know, and I hope that he really knew what that was about. But, you know, I think about, you know, young men today, they're looking for somebody to look up to. And, you know, in this passage we're going to look at tonight, Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 30. I wouldn't doubt that Brother Justyn has preached this verse before, maybe. I don't know. It's a powerful verse. And, you know, today being Father's Day, you know, I had the privilege to be with my dad today. Don't usually get this chance. We're 1,100 miles away, but had a great chance to be with my dad on Father's Day this year. And, you know, this verse says, God, here he says, I sought for a man among you, among them, that should make up the hedge and stand in the gap before me for the land, that I should not destroy it, but I found none. Now, what is the background of this verse? Well, if you go back and you read the chapter, you'll find that earlier in the chapter, God talks about all the sins of Israel, and he talks about the condition of the nation at this time, the condition of the fact that there's bloodshed and idolatry rampant throughout the land. There is contempt for parents. There is disregard for the Sabbath or for the things of God. There is adultery and incest. There's bribes and extortion. There is lying prophets. And I thought, man, that sounds like reading the newspaper. That sounds like our day. You know, the Bible does say there's nothing new under the sun, doesn't it? But it's sad as you read this chapter, God talks about all these things. He talks about the bloodshed for no reason, murder and idolatry. And if you know anything at all about the Old Testament, you know that God judged Israel over and over and over for their sin of going into idolatry and following other gods. Contempt for parents. These young people didn't have any respect for their parents. They disregarded the day of God, the Sabbath. They committed adultery and incest. They were taking bribes and extorting from others. And the saddest of all is the lying prophets. Those who are supposed to have the truth, and yet they're giving out a lie. And so what does God do? He decides he's going to scatter the nation of Israel. He decides he's going to scatter them among the nations around them, all the nations that they think are so great. And it says that he's going to throw them in the furnace of his wrath. But in this chapter, you see all of those words. You see God making it very clear that he's not going to put up with this anymore. You see God making it very clear that he has had it with this nation, the apple of his eye. And yet, in the middle of that, he says, I sought for a man among them that should make up the hedge and stand in the gap before me, that I should not destroy it. You know, I read this story and I think to myself, this verse leads me to believe that if God had found one godly man, he would have stayed his judgment. Why? Because that godly man can make a difference. That godly man could turn the tide. That godly man could change the whole face of the country if really totally and completely set apart to God, if totally and completely dedicated to God and given to God's things. And so what was God looking for? And I had to ask myself that question. What is it that God was looking for in this one man? He was looking for a committed man, sold out to God. Somebody who didn't care what the cost was. Somebody who's willing to lay down their life if necessary. Somebody who was willing to be godly and courageous and had convictions and was faithful to God first and to his family and to those around him. That's the person God was looking for. Sadly today, even in church, it's hard to find men like that. I think part of the reason is that we don't have that great of examples a lot of times in our world. I came across a statistic that just blew me away when I read it that says right now in America, 75% of young African American boys and girls grow up without a father. 75%. 50% of Latino, Spanish people, young boys and young girls grow up without a father. And 25% of Caucasian, white families grow up without a father. And I read that statistic and it broke my heart because what happens to all those people who have no example? They grew up and they don't know to be an example. The only thing that can change that is this right here, and a commitment to God and a willingness to decide, I'm going to stop this chain of brokenness. I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to be committed to God. I'm going to be faithful even if it costs me everything. Young boys today, and men, they're confused about what a man is. They understand that women want a man who's soft and tender, and then when he becomes that, they don't want him because they don't respect him. We're in a mess, folks. And the only thing that's going to change it is God. Right. First in our lives. Only God. A man, a father, men who are willing to be a father to somebody else's child that doesn't have a father, who are willing to stand in the gap. You know, I was thinking recently, as the church, I think we have done a great disservice to this world when we talk about so many things, especially in the political arena that we're in, and we tell people we should be against abortion, and yes, we should be against abortion. But you know what? The church should be the first one to stand up and say, I'll take that child if you'll keep it. I'll raise that child as my own. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll take 6 of them if I need to take 6 so that those children don't have to die. It's not enough that we say we're against abortion. What are we doing to save those children? Are we willing to take that pregnant mother into our house and let her stay with us and at no cost and make sure that she has the medical care and that she has the love and the encouragement, and if she's not a Christian, that we bring her to Jesus Christ? Are we willing to take those young boys that we see out in the neighborhood are causing trouble, and we're willing to become a mentor to them, and we're willing to take them on fishing trips or take them camping or take them down to the racetrack and let them run go-karts or something like that so they can see what it is to see a godly man and a godly family who love Jesus and something better than they know. Right. It's not enough to say we're against something. What are we for? The world knows they think we're against everything. My goodness, they think we're against those cakes that you gave out a little while ago, brother. If they can find a way to make us believe that. They should know what we're for more than what we're against. Because you know what? Nobody likes to be told not to do something except when they are given something better and they can see that it's better. And they can see it lived out. You know, as I read this story, I thought to myself, we are in the situation we are in America today, not because of the politicians in Washington. We're not in this condition because of whoever was president last or whoever's president now or whoever's going to be in 4 years. We are in the condition we are today because God's people have decided they'll just sit back and they'll let things happen and then complain about it instead of doing something about it. I want to tell you something. If every Christian across America would stand up for what is right and say, you know what, enough is enough. We're not going to put up with this anymore. If you vote for that, we're voting you out and we have enough votes to do it, and we would really do that, it would change the face of this country. You say, well, how do you know that? Well, right here he says if one man had done it, God would have changed his mind. Are we willing to stand in the gap? I think about David over in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 10. And as I understand it, David, I believe when he was on the run from King Saul before he actually became king, the king of Ammon had allowed him, or at least given him some respite, some protection while Saul was hunting him down. And he was his friend in some way. And his friend has died. The king of Ammon has died. And so David, being, the Bible does say he was a man after God's own heart. And we know he made plenty of mistakes, but I don't see that anywhere else in the Scripture, really. And David sent some servants. He sent some men to his friend's son, who is now the king. His name was Hanun, Hunun, Hanun. And he sent some men to him to console him, to say to the king, look, we are so sorry for your loss. King David has sent us to try to encourage you and try to be a blessing to you in this time of loss, this time of grief. This young man, I don't know how old he was, but I don't remember the Bible saying his age, but I get the impression that he was a little bit he just wasn't real smart. He was still wet behind the ears. He didn't have enough sense. And so, and maybe he had some other young men who were his advisors, and they said to the king, look, David, surely he's not just sending these guys over here to console you. He's got to be checking it out to see if he can take over our country. And he's getting ready to go to war against us. And so this young king, he listened to those guys, and what did he do? He went and he got a bunch of surrounding nations to come and help him, and he went to war against David. But there's an interesting verse in that chapter. Joab, David's general, they set their battle, their army in array against these other people and this king of Ammon. The Bible says that Joab realized that he had the enemy before him and behind him, and so he was in a bad spot. And he says to his men, he says, let us play like men for God and our nation, and our country. Let us play like men for our land, for our people. You know what? I thought about that verse, and I thought, you wouldn't think that Joab would have to say that, but what was he doing? He was reminding those young men out there in the middle of the battle, and ultimately God gave them the victory. The enemy ran from them when they saw that they were determined to do whatever it took. And they ran like a bunch of scaredy cats. But I thought, what was Joab reminding those men? He was reminding them, there is nobody else but us. If we're going to win, it's going to happen here. And I love that because you know what? I think that is true for every one of us, folks. If we're going to win in our homes, it's our responsibility, guys. If our family is going to grow up and love Jesus with all their heart, if they're going to grow up and revere the church and love to go to church and love to sing and love to read the Bible and love to tell people about Jesus, they're going to learn that because they saw us do it. If they're bored with church, it's probably because we're bored with church. I want to tell you something. True Christianity is really caught more than it's taught in many ways. It's the example that we set. But so here God says, I sought for a man. Now what does he want this man to do? He wants this man to make up the hedge. Some years ago I did a study on John chapter 10. Matter of fact, I was thinking, man, this has been a long time ago, but I actually did quite a long series at El Vista on John 10, and I preached through that on Sunday nights in training union for quite some time. And so I really got into it. I began to really dig. And one of the things, when I think about this verse, to make up the hedge, it reminded me of, in many places in the Holy Land and in arid areas, they would take and they would actually build sheepfolds out of huge briars and thistles, and they would build this wall, and they would kind of weave those briars and bushes together, and they would weave them so tightly that an animal or an enemy could not get through. But as you can imagine, if you take and you cut something and you begin to weave it, eventually, because it's not alive anymore, it begins to break down. And so they would often have little holes. And so they would have to go back in, and they would have to protect that spot. They would have to be aware of that weakness. And many times a shepherd would have, that's where he would sleep, because that would be the most vulnerable part, where an animal or an enemy would try to get in. And I picture that here. He says, make up the hedge. So what does that mean, guys? That means that you and I are the first line of defense against the enemy in terms of our home. I mean, we can only do so much. You know, God obviously is the ultimate protector, but He asks us to be the first line of defense in the human realm, in our home. These shepherds, they were constantly making needed repairs to make sure that those holes did not allow a predator to come in. And I thought to myself, or maybe it's a break in the city wall. Maybe there's a weak spot in the city wall. And the enemy always looks for the weak spot. And of course, who's the enemy? The devil. He looks for the weak spot in all of us. He says, I want you to make up the hedge. I want you to shore up that weakness in the city wall. I began to think, and I'll tell you what, when you start asking questions like this, it really gets serious. All right, Lord, what's some vulnerable areas in my life and in my home? What are some areas that the devil is going to use, that the devil is going to target because they're weak spots? Those weak spots can be any number of things, what areas in our homes are vulnerable? Well, I want to tell you, one of the first places the devil is going to try to hit you is with your kids. He's going to try and get them because they're still young. They're still immature. They don't understand how vulnerable they are. They don't understand that internet that they're on, there are people on there who say that they're 10 years old when they're 30 years old. Right. When they have ill intent and they I just want to meet you and, let's be friends. I want to be your pen pal and all of that. It's a dangerous place. Predators who would seek to harm them through so many places. I want to tell you something. There are people right now in our world who I consider predators who are in the education business. And they're trying to destroy your children's mind by making them believe that what God says is an abomination is okay. We have to guard that. Wrong teaching. Whether it be even religious teaching. I want to tell you something. Just because a guy says he's a preacher and he's on the television or on the radio doesn't mean you should believe him. Right. It certainly doesn't mean you should let your kids just listen to them without some careful watch over that. Television has always been a challenge. I remember a time years ago when our television broke and Dad just decided, you know what, I'm not going to fix it. And we didn't have a television, I know, for 10 or 12 years, it seemed like. And it's amazing how much more time in the day I had after that. I mean, I didn't get to watch a whole lot of TV anyway, but it was amazing, especially in the summertime, when school's out and all of a sudden, man, boy, and I can hear it like it was yesterday, Mom. All right, outside. Outside. I've had enough of you inside. Get outside, go do something. Of course, we lived in a day where you didn't have to worry about somebody coming up trying to snatch you off the side of the road or stuff like that. I mean, we'd be out in the woods, climbing trees, making tree houses, going down to the corner, raiding the mulberry tree, all kind of stuff, and it was good, you're out of the house, fresh air. Kids today, they're going to have arthritis in their thumbs when they get to be my age from that stupid phone. They don't know what. I remember playing in the creek, making forts. I remember in the wintertime, from the time I got up out of bed, especially if there was no school that day or school got called because of snow days. We don't have those in Florida, by the way. But school got called. Now we get school called for hurricanes, but But I remember going out, and we lived out in the country out by Bartonville out there, and I can remember our house set back a little bit from our neighbor's house on the west side of us, and so the snow would just pile right through the front yard. And man, we had sometimes that thing would be 5 or 6 foot deep snowdrift out there. Boy, we'd be out there digging forts and cut tunnels and all this stuff in there, you know. And Mom's, all right, it's time to come in. Oh, do I have to? You know, we just loved that. I mean, we might be out there 6, 7 hours.
Right.
Come in to change, get some dry clothes on, go back out again. That's, kids today don't know about that. But I want to tell you something. The devil's looking for those weaknesses in our life. He's looking for those areas in our life, whether it be through the television or through movies or through the internet or through our phones or through people that are out there who are predatory in their intentions and however they get in touch with you or through your kids. You know, you wouldn't leave a window open at night in your kid's room. Not a chance. But guess what? We're doing that by many of these things. We're leaving a window open for people to get in. So he says, I'm looking for somebody to make up the hedge. I'm looking for somebody, secondly, to stand in the gap. To be that person between the enemy and your family. I'll never forget, I read a story about this lady. She was a little old lady. And she must have been about 80 years old. And she loved Jesus. I mean, she loved Jesus so much. And one night, somebody broke into her house. And she was, of course, scared, but she also loved the Lord, and she was just determined. And so she quietly got out of her bed. She went out there, and the person was rummaging around in the living room trying to take the television and the VCR or something. I don't know. He was in there. And she come out there, and the guy didn't hear her coming. She said, Acts 6:38. Guy just froze. He's looking around. He can't see nobody. It's dark. He starts to move. Acts 6:38. She said, get down on the floor. He got down on the floor. He didn't know what to think. Police showed up, and they said, Mister, what in the world? That little old lady, why in the world would you do that? Why would you get down on the floor and lay there until the police come? He said, she said she had an axe and 238. That's all he heard. You know, we're the line. He says, stand in the gap. That woman was standing for her rights, for what she had worked hard for. God says, take a stand in our world. I want to tell you something. It's not easy to take a stand for the Lord. And it's going to get more difficult all the time. But I guess I want us to think about it. Is it worth it when we're right with God? Yes, it is. Is it worth it to hear God say to us, well done, because you did what was hard? I want to tell you something. It's a sad thing today in our world. Most people, men and women alike, look for the easy way. They look for the easy way. I want to tell you something. You look at your Bible, you'll find out that anybody who really did something great for God were people who did the hard things. I don't see anywhere where it was an easy way to go. He says, take a stand. One person said, if you don't take a stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And I think that is really true. What kind of stand are we taking? Are we saying to the world, you know what? I take a stand for marriage between a man and a woman. That's what God said, for life. I take that stand. And I'm sorry that you don't agree with me, but guess what? If you would listen, and here's another point that we need to get back to what I said before about being against a lot of things. I want to tell you something. If Christians would live the kind of marriage, husband and wife would live the kind of marriage that they're supposed to be, the world would be saying, man, I want some of that. Instead of, I don't want that. All they do, they fight worse than I do. If we had that kind of example, the world would be saying, man, I want that. I want to be a part of that. But they're not seeing a whole lot. They're not seeing it. Matter of fact, in some cases, they're seeing it worse. Take a stand. Do we know where the gaps are? Do we have convictions that we would die for? He says, are you willing to stand in the gap? before me. Notice he says before me. In this case, you have this picture of this person literally that is standing between God and his judgment and the nation of Israel. Reminds me of old Moses. God says, I'm just going to wipe them out. Moses said, no, wait a minute, God. And he stood in the gap. And he said, God, you know what? That's not what you brought us out here for. And he stood in the gap, and he caused God to say, no, well, okay, I'm going to, and God changed his mind. He decided not to do it. Be courageous. That sometimes means that you stand alone. I shared this with our church family some time ago. I guess you'd say in some ways I'm bivocational. I have a couple part-time jobs that I do as well as pastoring. And a company that I work for, we were working one day, and I had a helper with me, and came lunchtime, and there's 3 owners of the company at that time. One of the owners was with us that day, and he said, okay, guys, let's go and get some lunch. And so I'm following him. You know, I didn't know where we were going to go. He didn't say where we were going to go. And we pull into this parking lot, and he pulls up and parks in front of Hooters. And I didn't even pull into a parking spot. I just pulled up behind him, and I said, sir, I'm sorry, but I'm not, if you're going in there, I'm not going. He said, oh, it's no big deal. I said, yeah, it is a big deal. I said, I'm not going in there because that's not right for me to do that. And it's really not, but you guys can do whatever you want. I'll find somewhere else to eat. You guys go and have, do whatever you're going to do. But I'm going to go somewhere else. And I said, I don't mean to make a big deal about it. It's not a big deal. It is a big deal to me. It doesn't have to be to you, but I'm not going in there. He says, well, okay, where do you want to go? I said, well, there's a Steak and Shake right around the corner. He said, okay, well, let's go there. So everybody went to Steak and Shake with me. And the fellow in the truck with me, who's not a Christian, he said, boy, I'm sure glad you said that because I didn't want to go in there either. And I thought to myself, what if I had said, okay. And you know what? Nobody maybe would have ever known, but God would have, and I would have. And I'm grateful that was one of the times I did it right. You know what I'm saying? We all make mistakes. But the point is, take a stand. There are some things that it doesn't matter who's asking you to do it, you still need to take a stand and say, no, I'm not doing that. That's what God was asking for right here. He's asking for a man that even if his best friend, even if another preacher's asking him to do it, he's not going to do it because it's not right and it's against God. We need to take a stand. Taking a stand means not only being courageous when we, sometimes we have to stand by ourselves, but it also means don't live for yourself. Don't live for yourself. I want to tell you something. One of the easiest things for us to do is be selfish because that's just our natural default. Where, if we got to make a choice between doing something that's going to take some time, and it maybe, I'm sure nobody else in here is impatient ever, but if you just happen to be a little bit of an impatient person, and what you're going to have to do is going to cause you to have to wait, or have to wait on somebody else. He said, oh, man, it's not worth it. I'm just going to go do my own thing. That's just plain selfishness, especially when it comes to our families. Sometimes we have to make hard choices. It also means watching your mouth. Now, I know none of you in here ever say anything that you shouldn't say. Right? I didn't notice any amens right there, Brother Justyn. I'm kind of surprised. Now, I thought you had a perfect church here. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1 reminds us that a soft answer turns away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. I want to tell you something. Recently somebody put this on Facebook, and I reshared it and said, on some days my greatest accomplishment is just the fact that I kept my mouth shut. You know what? That's some days. That's it. But you know what? Watching what we say and how we say it, it's not even always what we say. Because you know what? As Christians, we don't say anything that would be considered, a bad word. But I want to tell you something. The attitude that comes with it is just as bad as the word might have been. Watch what you say. Standing in the gap means loving our wives sacrificially. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul reminds the church there, and he reminds all of us men that we are supposed to act the same way Jesus did when he laid down his life for the church. That means, guys, when was the last time you sacrificed your plans for your wife because you knew it meant a lot to her? When was the last time you didn't do what you wanted to do because you knew it was better to do what they needed you to do, what your family needed you to do? Put God first and then your family. Don't live for yourself. Be alert for any new gaps in the family wall. Watch what's being posted. I thought it was interesting. I don't know if you guys are seeing these. Every once in a while I'll catch a commercial here and there, but there's actually making commercials on television now that are telling people not to bring their cell phones to the table for dinner. Have you guys seen those up here? I don't know if you've seen them. I thought to myself, isn't that interesting? The lost world is telling us to put the phones away. Now, it wasn't the cell phone companies, I'm sure, but it was somebody. And I thought to myself, who would think you would have to even say that? But you know what? I was in a restaurant recently, and I saw the reason. I looked across the restaurant, and there was 4 people sitting at the table, and every one of them was sitting there on their phones going like this. Not a word said between them. They're just sitting there on their phone. I want to tell you, we've got to be careful. Because even if it's just the fact that we are disconnected from our family, that's a gap in the wall. That's a big thing. I want to tell you something. You mark my words. Somebody else probably way smarter than me probably said this too, but I guarantee you what we're going to see in our world in about 20 years is people who have grown up in this technological age that is all texting, who don't know how to talk to people in person.
Right.
They won't even be able to get a job because they can't talk to somebody face to face. That should not be us. In closing, the last thing that I see here is the statement. I look for a man who should make up the hedge and stand in the gap before me for the land, that I should not destroy it. This one man that God was looking for could have changed the judgment on this nation. And as you continue reading, you'll find that God did bring the judgment. He did literally put them in the furnace of His wrath. Why? Because He didn't find this person. He didn't find this man. Now, it says, I look for a man, but I want to tell you something. God's looking for women who stand in the gap too. I know this is Father's Day, and that's why a little bit of focus on, but I want to tell you something. God's looking for men and women who are willing to do what we've talked about today. I want to tell you something. A husband and wife who will get the concept of what we talked about here tonight and what the Word of God says here, and they will partner together and they will do whatever God asks them to do. I want to tell you something. That home will change their immediate mission field, their immediate family, their friends, their co-workers. They're going to see a huge difference take place simply because, you know what? People don't know what to do with somebody who is willing to stand in the gap. And you know, I read that, and it's probably one of the saddest verses in all the Bible. That God says, I'm looking for this person. And if I had found them, I would not have destroyed my people. But God said, I didn't find them. Probably the saddest thing in the history of the nation of Israel right here is that God couldn't find a godly man who would stand in the gap. That was a long time ago. But folks, we're still breathing. We're still in a nation that has at least some freedom, you know. And I want to tell you something, if we don't begin to take to heart what we've talked about here tonight and really begin to make up the hedge and stand in the gap, we're going to have less and less freedoms as time goes on. And we're going to see this nation become like China, some other nations around the world. But guess what? This verse gives me great hope too, because I believe the truths and the principles of God's Word are true for every generation. I believe that. And if you and I are willing to stand up and say, God, you know what? I want to be that man. I want to be that woman who's going to stand in the gap. I want to be that one who's going to make up the hedge, who's going to be in the reparation business. Folks, I want to tell you something. It's not enough to complain and gripe about those people who struggle with addictions or are out there doing terrible things if we're not willing to do whatever it takes to reach those people and bring them to Jesus. Gripe and complain about other nations and how terrible they are and what they're trying to do to America. The best thing we could ever do is not send bullets, but Bibles. Send Jesus. Give them the truth that they're really looking for. But it's going to take you and me being willing to stand in the gap and do whatever it takes, whatever it costs. I want to tell you something. One of the reasons the devil is winning in so many arenas today is because his followers don't mind paying the bills. They don't care what it costs. You know, I've been a pastor a long time, 20 years in my church. You see there, I don't know how they put up with me all that time, but anyways. One of the things that quite often happens when you're having a meeting and you're talking about doing something, well, what's it going to cost, preacher? That should be the last question we ask. The first question is, does God want us to do this? And if He does, it doesn't matter what it costs, because God always provides. The question isn't, what does it cost to do it? Maybe the better question is, what does it cost if we don't? What does it cost if we don't? And ask God, Lord, I need your direction. I need your wisdom. You know, we're in a season in our church where we're getting ready to do some pretty radical things. We're selling our property, relocating, and thank God has sent us a buyer that says that they can come up with the money. We've got to find a piece of land, more room where we can grow. And you know, my dream and my hope is that, you know, we believe that God wants us to do this. And you know, one day I'd love to have a Christian school and some other things there as God would provide and He would lead. But you know what? Following God is not for the faint of heart. If you're looking for the easy path, you can just about count that it's downstream away from what God wants. In our town years ago, I'm not even sure if it's still there, there was this wall, a brick wall on the side of a house, you know, in the backyard of a house, and consistently people would come by and they would paint graffiti on it. And it was terrible, and of course, you know, it's always looked bad. And so one day, a church youth group came to the owner of that house and said, look, if you would let us, we would like to paint that wall, and we're going to paint a mural on that wall, just as kind of as an experiment. And if you allow us to do it, it won't cost you anything, but we'll keep it up and we'll make sure it looks nice. And if you'll allow us to do this, we think it might just change the whole, you know, neighborhood. And so the owner said, what do I got to lose? I'm tired of painting it myself. So he agreed. And so they came and they painted the whole wall, all just beautiful white. And then they painted all these fish on there, just, you know, kind of goofy looking fish. They had groupers and whatever, and they had all these fish on there. And all of them were facing one direction except this one little fish. And it was going the other way. And it said, and then they painted across the bottom, go against the flow. I want to tell you that wall remained ungraffitied for years. Nobody ever came back and painted anything else on there because of that mural on there. And I would go by there day after day. It was on the way to our friend's house, BJ and Susie, good friends of ours. And I'd go by there and I'd think, man, that is a great, great sign. Folks, I want you to know, in case you haven't noticed, as a Christian, if we're walking with God, if we're faithful to God, if we're committed to God, we have to go against the flow. That's the only way. Any dead fish can float downstream. But a live one, it's got to go against the flow. Let's pray.